Everyone at that corner cafe in Denver thought they knew what kind of place it was, just another stop in the morning rush, a backdrop for lattes and laptop screens. But for Calvin Moore, it was something different. It wasn't just a cafe, it was one of the last places where he could still feel human. Every day between 9 and 10 a.m., he walked in quietly, wearing the same olive green military jacket that had seen more of the world than most of the people in that room ever would. His coins were always counted out precisely in a plastic bag. His good morning, a soft nod. His spot by the window claimed without fuss. The jacket still bore his name stitched to the chest. Sergeant Moore. Most people saw only a worn man with a beard, maybe a drifter, someone invisible in the periphery of daily life. But that day, as the cold wind pressed harder than usual through the city, two officers noticed him and decided he didn't belong. What started as a routine patrol escalated quickly. They walked in, uniforms stiff with authority, and focused directly on Calvin. Without asking for context, without knowing his name or his story, they confronted him like he was a threat. What they didn't expect was that their actions would set off a chain of events that none of them could undo. Because Calvin Moore wasn't just a man drinking coffee. He was a piece of living history, forgotten maybe, but not erased. The officers, Reed and Jacobs, had been responding to a vague report. A suspicious man loitering near businesses. Reed, the older one, had the kind of demeanor that came with years of believing he knew better than most. Jacobs, still green, followed his partner's lead without hesitation. Through the window they had seen Calvin's unshaven face, his quiet posture, and most importantly, that military jacket. "You see that?" Reed said, pointing with his chin. "Another one of those pretending to be military for sympathy. Bet he stole that coat." Jacobs hesitated, unsure, but Reed pushed forward. They walked in. The mood in the cafe shifted as soon as the door swung open. Conversations softened. Customers glanced up, then looked away. The barista paused mid-order. The officers didn't stop at the counter. They headed straight to Calvin's table. "Good morning, sir. Mind if we talk to you for a second?" Reed asked, but it wasn't really a question. Calvin looked up, calm but tired. "Sure," he said simply. "That coat yours?" Reed asked. "Yes. Earned it in the service." The doubt in their eyes deepened. "Where'd you serve?" "Middle East. Special Forces. Until 2018. Reed gave a short, mocking laugh. "And now you're here, drinking coffee with spare change?" Calvin didn't flinch. "Now I'm just trying to remember who I used to be." By then, the entire cafe was watching, but no one was saying anything. Not yet. The tension in the room thickened as Reed took a step closer. The manager of the cafe, sensing something wasn't right, approached from behind the counter with cautious steps. "Is everything okay here, officers?" he asked, voice measured. Reed didn't even turn to look at him. "We got a report. Just need to verify if this jacket's legitimate." The manager hesitated. "He's been coming here for months, always polite, pays what he owes, never caused trouble." Reed ignored the reassurance. "Being polite doesn't mean someone's clean," he snapped, then turned to Jacobs. Without warning, Jacobs stepped in and tugged on the sleeve of Calvin's coat, flipping it to look inside. He found a stitched label, Calvin D. Moore, and a serial number. Still, he wasn't satisfied. "Could have gotten this at a thrift store. Doesn't prove anything." Calvin, holding his coffee steadily, didn't resist. "Can I make a call first?" he asked quietly. "You'll have time for that at the station," Reed said coldly, pulling out the handcuffs. The metallic click echoed across the cafe. Gasps followed. A woman whispered to herself, "He looks like my brother. He served too. They forgot him too." No one intervened. No one stood up. But in the silence that filled the space after the cuffs locked in place, there was a shared discomfort. Shame clung to the air, even if no one named it. Outside, the cold bit deeper, and Calvin's jacket offered little warmth against the humiliation. He walked with the officers, not struggling, not speaking. His dignity didn't come from pride. It came from memory, from survival. In the back of the patrol car, Jacobs sat quietly, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. Calvin met his gaze, not angrily, but with a calm that unsettled him. "What if he's telling the truth?" Jacobs finally murmured. Calvin didn't answer at first, then let out a small smile, half amused, half tired. "When you call to confirm, you'll understand everything." Jacobs furrowed his brow but said nothing more. The car rolled forward, headed for District 12, a cold gray building in downtown Denver, worn from years of wear and bureaucracy. As they pulled in, Calvin's wrists still marked from the cuffs, he stepped out with the same grace he had when he walked into the cafe. No protest, no outburst, just quiet strength. Inside, officers laughed in the background. Phones rang, reports shuffled. Reed announced their arrival with an air of self-importance. Got one. Wearing military attire. No ID. Claims to be former Special Forces. Name's Calvin Moore. The officer at the desk began typing. A few seconds in, her expression shifted. Her fingers froze. She looked at the screen, then at Calvin. Suddenly different. She didn't speak, just printed a form and said, "Take him to room 3. Wait for verification." The processing room was bare. Just a metal table, 2 chairs, and a dim light overhead. No windows, no clock, only the quiet hum of institutional neglect. Reed removed the cuffs with an unnecessary shove, tossing them onto the table. "Sit," he barked, as if talking to someone dangerous. Calvin sat calmly, his wrists still red from the pressure. Across the table, Jacobs seemed less sure now, fidgeting with his hands, stealing glances at the man they'd brought in. "You say you served," Jacobs said, his voice low, almost unsure of itself now. "But you don't have ID. No proof." Calvin leaned forward, still calm. "I don't need to prove anything to you. I just want my phone call." Reed scoffed, arms crossed. "What do you think this is, a movie? Who are you gonna call? Some imaginary lawyer?" Calvin met his eyes. "I'm gonna call the man whose life I saved. Maybe he can teach you what respect looks like." For the first time, Jacobs didn't respond with sarcasm. Instead, he stood up. "Let him make the call," he said, looking at Reed. "If it's nothing, we lose 5 minutes." Reed muttered something under his breath, annoyed but curious. He unplugged the wall phone and stretched the cord across the room. "One number, 1 minute." Calvin picked up the receiver. No hesitation. The digits came from memory like muscle. He didn't even need to think. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then a 4th. Finally, a voice answered. "Office of General David Keller." Calvin straightened his back. "Sergeant Calvin Moore. Code 21A West 710. I need to speak with him immediately." A pause. Silence stretched just long enough to feel heavy. Then, "One moment, please." The line clicked, then went dead for 20 long seconds. Reed rolled his eyes, but Jacobs leaned in slightly, tension growing. When the voice returned, it was deeper, commanding. "Is this Moore? Where are you?" "District 12, Denver, detained. For wearing my own jacket." There was no disbelief in the response, no outrage, just authority. "Stay where you are. Say nothing to anyone. I'm on my way." The line went dead. Calvin gently set the phone down, crossed his hands on the table, and looked up at Reed, who was suddenly less cocky. "Done with your little call?" Reed said, trying to hold on to the upper hand. Calvin didn't flinch. "You might want to call someone too. What's coming isn't small." Jacob swallowed hard, sensing something shift in the room. The walls, once so familiar, suddenly felt too tight. It wasn't just about a jacket anymore. Something bigger was unraveling, and they had no idea how deep it would go. Less than 30 minutes later, the quiet hum of the precinct's reception area was broken by the arrival of 3 unmarked black vehicles. They parked without haste, but with unmistakable purpose. From the lead car, a man stepped out dressed in a dark suit, polished shoes, and wearing a silver badge hanging from his neck, the insignia of the Department of Military Intelligence. The desk officer nearly spilled her coffee when she saw him. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice strained. "I'm here on behalf of General David Keller. Where is Mr. Calvin Moore?" he asked with calm precision. Within moments, the captain of the precinct, Thompson, had been summoned to the front desk. The room's energy changed instantly. Thompson, a seasoned officer with decades in the force, kept his tone even, but his posture had stiffened. "May I ask the nature of your visit, sir?" "Your officers detained a highly decorated war veteran without proper verification, bypassing federal military records. The general wants a full report by end of day and immediate release of Sergeant Moore, with a formal apology from your department." Thompson's face paled. Administrative mistakes were one thing, but this was political, powerful, and personal. He nodded tightly and made his way to room 3 himself. Inside, Calvin was still seated, unshaken, arms crossed, eyes calm. "Sergeant Moore," Thompson began, emphasizing the title as a subtle, belated apology. "Please, would you come with me?" Calvin stood, adjusted his jacket, and gave a brief nod to Jacobs, who lowered his eyes in response. Reed said nothing. pretending not to notice the shift in the air. There were no cuffs this time, no rush, just a quiet walk through a suddenly silent precinct. As Calvin stepped out of the precinct building, the cold air met him again, but it didn't sting like before. This time, he stood a little taller. He wasn't being escorted by force. He was being acknowledged. From there, he was driven, gently, respectfully, to the military base medical center in Colorado Springs. No press, no ceremony, just a clean room with soft light, a small potted plant on the windowsill, and silence. Not the kind of silence that erases you, but the kind that heals. Calvin sat in that room, breathing slowly, the smell of antiseptic mixing with the warmth of peace. Meanwhile, across the city, in a confidential office within the Department of Military Intelligence, his name was being spoken aloud for the first time in years. Calvin D. Moore. On computer screens, in folders once marked confidential, a narrative was unfolding. One of sacrifice, of silence, of service never properly honored. Officers reading through his record fell quiet, scrolling through pages of a life buried beneath red tape. His service began in 2003, shortly after 9/11. Raised in Detroit, he'd joined to escape the dead ends of a forgotten neighborhood, full of fire and fury and idealism. He wasn't just another soldier. He became one of the elite. Missions stacked one after another, until one day, in Kandahar, 2011, he saved not only his unit, but the life of then Colonel Keller, dragging him nearly 300 meters under fire, despite his own injuries. It was all there in the reports, in dusty folders that no one had read in years. Now, those details were no longer just paperwork. They were truth reclaiming its space. As the information poured in, the full picture of Calvin Moore's service came into sharp focus. He wasn't just a veteran. He was a hero. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, multiple service commendations, each one a testament to battles survived and lives saved. But none of that had mattered when he returned home. Like so many others, Calvin came back to a country that didn't know what to do with broken warriors. There were no parades, no counseling, just silence. He tried to reintegrate, to find normalcy again. Took odd jobs, worked security, drove deliveries, did maintenance. But the nightmares followed him everywhere. Loud noises triggered memories of gunfire. Crowds made him sweat like he was under siege. He spiraled. One day, while restocking shelves at a grocery store, he collapsed in the cereal aisle. A panic attack so severe they thought it was a heart attack. He was discharged the same day with no follow-up, no support. That was the beginning of the free fall. He lost his job. His wife left. His family stopped answering calls. And slowly the walls of his life crumbled until all he had was a backpack, a coat, and the streets. Yet through it all, he held on to the one thing that tethered him to who he had been. That old olive military jacket, folded carefully at night, placed beside him as he slept on benches. A ritual of dignity in a world that had forgotten him. That morning in the cafe, Calvin hadn't been looking for justice. He was just trying to get warm. One cup of coffee. One quiet moment before the chaos of the city swallowed him again. But the confrontation with the officers stirred something in him that had been dormant for years. Not anger, resolve. Because that badge on his chest, now questioned and mocked, meant something. It was stitched not just with thread, but with memories, sacrifice, and blood. And if they were going to strip him of that too, he needed to remind them who he was. Back at the base, after the confirmation of his records, he was invited to a private meeting. Captain Lang, head of the medical center, stood as Calvin entered. 2 representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs were also present. All of them stood. No one sat until he did. Lang looked at him not with pity, but with respect. "Sergeant Moore, I read every line of your file. Let me say this plainly. We failed you. The entire system did." Calvin remained composed. He didn't need validation. He needed truth. "We want to make it right," Lang continued. "You're entitled to assisted housing, full medical care, and retroactive benefits. But more than that, we want to hear your story. And, if you're willing, we'd like your help designing a program for homeless veterans like yourself." Calvin didn't speak right away. He looked down at his jacket, fingers brushing the patch. Then he looked up. "If I can keep one brother from ending up like me, I'm in." In that moment, Calvin wasn't just a reintegrated soldier. He became a symbol, a voice for all the others who never got the chance to speak. Back at District 12, the mood had changed. though no one would admit it aloud. There were no official statements, no viral news coverage, no headline scandals. But in the hallways, in the silences between conversations, in the way officers glanced toward the holding room where Calvin had been, it was there, a quiet reckoning. Reed and Jacobs had both been removed from street duty. No more patrols, no more uniforms. Assigned to administrative tasks, paperwork, internal filing, locked away from the public eye. It wasn't permanent, but it was deliberate. Reed saw it as punishment, grumbled about overreactions, slammed doors, and barked at anyone who dared disagree. But the silence around him was louder than any protest. Even the officers who used to laugh at his jokes now kept their distance. Jacobs, on the other hand, changed in a different way. He withdrew, not in anger, but in shame. Days passed with him hunched over file cabinets, organizing case folders, avoiding mirrors and conversation. He couldn't stop thinking about Calvin's face. Not when he was detained, but when he said calmly and without resentment, "You'll understand everything once you call." It haunted him, not because Calvin had been right, but because deep down, Jacobs had known something wasn't adding up from the beginning. But he hadn't spoken up, he hadn't stopped it, and now he carried that silence with him like a stain he couldn't scrub off. Behind the scenes, the Department of Internal Affairs opened a quiet investigation, not to make noise, but to make sense. 2 ethics officers from the Oversight Division arrived discreetly at District 12. They didn't come with accusations. They came with questions. Why had 2 trained officers failed to verify military credentials before making an arrest? Why had no one paused to ask if maybe, just maybe, this man was exactly who he claimed to be? They pulled body cam footage, reviewed radio logs, and requested written reports. The goal wasn't to punish. It was to understand how arrogance had become standard protocol. Captain Thompson, who had run the precinct for years with steady hands, felt the sting of guilt too. He wasn't a bad leader, but he had grown complacent, letting certain habits go unchecked. When he called a closed-door meeting with the staff, he didn't sugarcoat it. "The Moore incident," he said plainly, "isn't about one mistake. It's about how we've stopped seeing the people behind the uniforms, or the ones without them." He paused, letting the words settle. That ends now. In the days that followed, Jacobs made a decision. He drafted a letter, not a PR stunt, not a form apology. A real letter, scratched out by hand, rewritten 3 times before it felt honest. He handed it to Captain Thompson and asked quietly, "If it's appropriate, could you get this to him?" Thompson read the letter in silence, then gave a single nod. "It's more than appropriate, it's necessary." Calvin received the letter while still at the medical center. It was delivered in a plain envelope by one of the nurses, who didn't know what was inside, only that it had come from someone at the precinct. He opened it slowly, read it twice without saying a word. Jacobs had written about regret, not as an excuse but as an awakening. He wrote about how he hadn't been able to sleep since that day, how he realized he had used his badge as a shield against the uncomfortable truths he didn't want to see, and that if Calvin allowed it, he wanted to be part of something that helped prevent others from making the same mistake. Calvin folded the letter with care and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, the same coat they once doubted he deserved. He didn't say anything to the nurse. He just looked out the window for a long time, letting the silence settle around him like peace. Maybe, he thought, if someone that young could learn to listen, maybe others could too. It wasn't redemption. It was the first step toward it. Reed, meanwhile, refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. When interviewed by Internal Affairs, he stood by his version of events. "We followed protocol," he insisted. The guy was suspicious, wearing military gear with no ID. That's textbook verification grounds. He clung to technicalities like a lifeline, unwilling to admit that what really drove his actions wasn't policy, it was prejudice. One of the investigators, a retired Marine himself, asked Reed, "Do you know what it's like to sleep on concrete after serving your country?" Reed didn't answer, because he didn't. The review board didn't indict him. There was no public shaming. But the conclusion was clear. Reed wasn't fit for the field. He was placed on indefinite disciplinary leave. Jacobs, by contrast, was reinstated on a supervised basis, but not without conditions. He would undergo empathy training, psychological counseling, and serve as a peer educator in the department's new community engagement program. He didn't complain. He didn't resist. He accepted every step quietly, knowing that it was less about penance and more about becoming someone better. The precinct didn't issue statements. But inside its walls, things shifted. Reed's desk remained untouched, collecting dust. And in the main hallway, a new wooden plaque was mounted near the roll call board. It read, simply, "Dignity isn't seen in uniforms. It's felt in silence by those who've lived through war." No names were engraved, but everyone knew exactly who it honored. The justice Calvin received wasn't loud. It didn't come with cameras or press conferences. It was quiet, deliberate, and more powerful because of it. At the military base, his room became a space of calm. There were no patrols, no blaring horns, just the soft hum of healing. A pitcher of clean water sat on the nightstand, his clothes folded neatly on a chair, and a tiny plastic plant by the window reminded him that even something small could carry meaning. He started sleeping better. Not perfectly. There were still nights when the shadows of war crept in, but now, when he woke in a sweat, he wasn't alone. Margaret, the nurse who'd seen him since day one, would bring him hot tea and sit beside him quietly, saying nothing unless he needed it. That kind of care, simple and unforced, was something Calvin hadn't known in years. And in that stillness, his identity began to rebuild. Not as a war hero, not as a victim, but as a man trying to live with what he had left. Outside that room, however, his name had become something else. It echoed in briefings, in email threads, in quiet conversations between high-ranking officials, not as a scandal, but as a warning, as a mirror. Departments began to meet in closed-door sessions, Veterans Affairs, military reintegration officers, even legislative aides. The question was always the same. How did a man with this record go invisible for so long? There were no easy answers, but there was resolve. A new emergency division was created within the reintegration department. Its sole purpose, to locate and assist homeless veterans who had fallen off the grid. It wasn't about charity, it was about responsibility. The project was named quietly, without ceremony, in a gray room with no reporters. It was called the Moore Initiative, a tribute to a man who never asked for medals, but forced the system to see what it had been ignoring. Calvin learned about it through a soft-spoken aide who visited during one of his follow-up consultations. She told him that small teams of veterans would begin visiting shelters, stations, and street corners, documenting, listening, making sure no one else vanished into silence. "They'd like you to be an advisor," she said. He hesitated, touching the patch on his chest. The jacket was cleaner now, stitched with care, but it still bore the weight of years. After a pause, he said yes. Not because he wanted the role, but because he knew there were still too many others like him. Men and women sitting on benches, not waiting for help, but waiting to be seen. A few days later, the base commander invited Calvin into a modest office tucked behind the main hallway. It wasn't a ceremony, just a quiet meeting. There was a folder on the table, a black coffee in a steel mug, and the kind of respectful silence that said more than any speech could. The colonel informed him that internal reviews had been completed. The actions of the officers involved were being documented, and appropriate measures were in place. Officer Jacobs's letter was received with respect, the colonel added. He may never fully undo what happened, but he's trying. That counts for something. Then came the question Calvin had been half expecting. Did he want to pursue formal action? File charges? Seek compensation? Calvin's response was steady, almost reflexive. "I don't want a payout. I don't need revenge. I want change." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for sympathy. "I want every cop in this country to learn to see the man before they see the mess. To understand that not every broken soul is a threat. Some of us are just trying to breathe." The colonel nodded, visibly moved. He told Calvin that the phrase he had used, "Dignity doesn't scream, it endures," had already been integrated into internal training material. Across bases and departments, that message would be passed on, not because it was catchy, but because it was true. Calvin began to walk the base freely. He wasn't just a patient anymore. He became a mentor. Young soldiers sat with him during meals, asked him questions about war, about life, about loss. He didn't glamorize anything. He told the truth, sparingly, but with weight. He never mentioned living on the streets, never brought up the handcuffs. But those who paid attention could feel the gaps in the story, the chapters filled with silence. And that, too, became part of his message. One day, after speaking to a group of recruits about integrity, he ended with a sentence he hadn't planned. "If you ever meet someone who looks like they've lost everything, remember, they might have only lost your willingness to see them." That line stuck. It wasn't printed on posters or quoted in news stories, but inside the minds of those who heard it, it stayed. Back at the Center for Reintegration, Calvin settled into a new rhythm. He was no longer handling every intake. He trained others now, new counselors, some former homeless vets themselves. He taught them not with slides or jargon, but with presence. He showed them how to listen without fixing, how to ask without probing, how to sit in silence without rushing to fill it. His story didn't make him a celebrity, but it made him a compass. One afternoon, a group of new volunteers asked Calvin a simple question. Now that your life is calm again, what do you want most? They expected an answer like travel or reconnect with family. But Calvin didn't answer right away. He crossed his arms, looked down at the dirt path in the small garden behind the center and said, "I want no one to have to live what I lived just to be treated like a human." The room went quiet. That was it. No elaborate dream, no wish for accolades, just a hope for decency. Weeks later, a formal invitation arrived from the Army's national office, a request for Calvin to attend a policy panel on homelessness among veterans. He read it without expression, then looked up at the staff coordinator. "If someone has to speak honestly, I can do that," he said. He flew to Washington quietly, accompanied only by a military transport officer. The meeting was in a plain oval room, no cameras, just officials, civil, military, legislative. When it was Calvin's turn, he stood without notes and said simply, "I made a phone call from a cold room with cuffs on my wrists. That call changed my life, and the lives of hundreds since. I'm not asking for more money. I'm asking for more humanity." He sat back down, and the room remained quiet for longer than protocol usually allowed. After returning from D.C., Calvin's life stayed simple. He bought fresh bread in the mornings, greeted his neighbors by name, swept the sidewalk in front of his modest home. Sometimes he helped the elderly man next door carry his trash bins to the curb. Nothing heroic, just life. But for someone who had been forgotten, simply living without fear was a triumph. On one rainy afternoon, he passed a bus stop and saw a man huddled under a blanket, staring at the sidewalk with the hollow eyes of someone still lost. Calvin approached slowly, crouched beside him, and asked gently, "Had any coffee today?" The man shook his head. Calvin took out a small thermos from his bag and poured some into a paper cup. He didn't speak further. He just sat. No questions, no judgments, just presence. Because Calvin knew exactly how it started. He knew that before you could pull someone off the street, you had to pull the street out of them, and that could only be done with time, patience, and dignity. That evening, back home, Calvin sat on his porch, watching the sunset settle behind the quiet houses. He thought of everything: war, shame, silence, redemption, and he felt something he hadn't felt in decades: peace. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of calm. The next morning, Calvin showed up at the Reintegration Center like always. He greeted staff by name, organized that day's intake list, and poured himself a small coffee from the aging machine in the corner. Same routine, same corner seat, but something in the air felt different. Everyone sensed it, not in a sad way, but in a reverent, almost protective way. People spoke in softer tones. The staff didn't hover, but they watched him with the quiet awareness of knowing that this chapter was closing. Calvin didn't need to be there every day anymore. His job was done, not finished, but passed on. Before leaving that afternoon, he handed an envelope to the receptionist. "For the next counselors," he said simply. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line, written in his careful, steady hand. "If you listen with your heart, they'll know they can come home." It was signed simply, Moore. No titles, no medals. Just the name of a man who had turned silence into healing. A name that had become a quiet legend in the halls of places that once failed him. Time moved on, and so did Calvin. He slipped back into anonymity, but not obscurity. His presence lingered in the centers, in precincts, in the changed minds of officers and soldiers alike. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write a book. He turned down every request to make his story into a documentary. "I'm not the point," he told one producer. "The point is that there are thousands more like me, unseen, unheard, but no less worthy." And so, his legacy remained unspoken, but deeply felt. In every cup of coffee offered without suspicion, in every name remembered by a caseworker, in every officer who paused before reaching for handcuffs. It wasn't glory, it was change. One rainy afternoon, the nurse Margaret stopped by the center with an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from General Keller. It said, "Today I read that over 200 veterans have been located and helped through the program you helped build. Many of them said the same thing. I was heard for the first time in years. You're not just part of this. You're the reason it began. With respect, always, Keller." Calvin read the letter once, slowly, then folded it and placed it inside the notebook where he kept the names and stories of those he'd helped. He didn't say much. He never did. But the smile in his eyes said enough. The mission wasn't over. It had just changed form. Spring arrived with quiet footsteps. Calvin often sat on the wooden bench in the small garden behind his home, watching the green slowly overtake the grays of winter. The flowers weren't in full bloom yet, but he didn't mind. He liked the in-between, the space where change took its time. Birds chirped softly, and the morning sun warmed his face as he closed his eyes and breathed in a peace that felt earned. Inside his house, the olive-green military jacket now hung neatly on a wall mount. He didn't wear it daily anymore. It had served its purpose. It was no longer a shield or proof of worth. It had become memory, a memory he had tamed and honored, not one he carried like a burden. Since that last visit to the cafe, the place where everything had unraveled and then come full circle, Calvin had adjusted his pace. He still spent time at the center, but now mostly as a mentor to new counselors. He trained them, listened to their doubts, reminded them that real healing begins with quiet listening. He didn't try to be the face of anything. He just wanted the work to keep going, even without him. One afternoon during a training session, one of the new volunteers asked Calvin what he wished for most now that things had finally settled. They expected a modest answer. Maybe travel, maybe family. Calvin paused, looked down at the dirt beneath his boots, then answered plainly that no one should have to lose everything to be treated like someone. That silence after his words wasn't uncomfortable. It was full. It was understanding. A few weeks later, a formal letter came from the Army's Central Office, an invitation for Calvin to speak on a national veterans policy panel. The letter was respectful, detailed, and personal. He smiled gently while reading it, then turned to one of the center coordinators and said, "If someone needs to say it plain, I can do that." And so he went, quietly, no entourage, just a man with his coat, his notes, and a voice earned through fire. The panel was small, the room unadorned. When it was his turn to speak, Calvin stood without a script and told the truth. He spoke of a phone call made from a holding room, of the weight of silence, of what it meant to be invisible in a country you once served. He didn't ask for applause. He asked for change. And when he sat back down, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of respect. In the final days of April, Calvin's life moved at a pace he had learned to treasure. He woke early, walked to the local market for bread, greeted neighbors by name, and swept the sidewalk in front of his modest home. Sometimes he helped the elderly man next door with the recycling or exchanged a few words with the postman. It wasn't remarkable by most standards. But for Calvin, this rhythm was everything. To live without fear, to be seen without suspicion, to move through a day without having to prove your worth. That was the truest form of freedom. One gray afternoon, while walking past a bus stop, he saw a man hunched over on the pavement, wrapped in a blanket, eyes hollow and fixed on nothing. Calvin stopped, sat down beside him. "Have you eaten?" he asked softly. The man shook his head. Calvin pulled a thermos from his bag, poured coffee into a paper cup, and handed it over without a word. He didn't preach. He didn't ask questions. He just sat there, because he understood. Before you can save someone from the streets, you have to help them feel like they still belong in the world. And that only happens one moment, one cup, one conversation at a time. That night, Calvin returned home and sat on his porch, watching the stars peek through a slowly clearing sky. He closed his eyes and let the stillness wash over him. Not the silence of being ignored, but the peace of being enough. His memories didn't vanish. He could still hear the echoes of combat, the static of radio calls, the sudden thump of helicopters overhead. But they no longer held him hostage. They passed through him now, like old ghosts that no longer wanted to haunt. The next morning, he went to the center just like before, greeted the team, helped organize the day's schedule, poured himself a small cup of coffee, but everyone could feel it. This was different, not final, not sad, just a shift. He had given everything he had to the mission, and now others were ready to carry it forward. Before leaving that day, Calvin placed an envelope on the reception desk. It was addressed to future counselors. Inside was a simple note, handwritten in his clear, deliberate style. If you listen with your heart, they'll find their way home. No signature, no rank, just truth. Time passed, and though Calvin faded from the spotlight, his impact did not. His name became part of quiet conversations in precincts and veteran centers across the country. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a compass. Officers spoke about the more standard in briefing rooms. Social workers referred to his approach during training sessions. No poster bore his face. No viral video told his story. But in every cup of coffee served without suspicion, in every gentle approach to a man on the street, in every moment of hesitation before judgment, Calvin's presence lived on. At District 12, a chapter in the officer's manual was renamed the Moore Protocol. It emphasized respectful engagement, especially with individuals who showed signs of military service. The language was clinical, but the purpose was human. Jacobs, now a peer educator, led those sessions himself, and in one class, he told the story, not of his mistake, but of the man he had once misjudged. "I cuffed someone who saved more lives than I ever will," he said, "and he still looked at me like I was worth saving too." Some recruits shifted in their seats, unsure how to respond, but none of them forgot what he said. Calvin never returned to the news, never sought recognition. When filmmakers approached to make a documentary about his life, he politely declined. "It's not entertainment," he said. "It's a reminder." Instead, he kept showing up, to shelters, to training sessions, to quiet conversations that needed a steady voice. His story lived not in headlines but in habits, in one-on-one talks with broken men, in coffee shared with strangers, in names remembered. One spring afternoon, he sat in the garden behind his home, the green fully returned now, and watched the sun trace slow paths across the earth. The jacket, clean, mended, and honored, hung inside. No longer armor, but legacy. A nurse from the early days visited him and asked what he thought of it all now. He smiled gently and replied, "I didn't fix the world, but I helped some people feel seen again. That's enough for me." And it was. Because in the quiet of that garden, with the birds chirping and the air warm with new life, Calvin Moore finally had what he had fought so long to find. Not victory, not vengeance, but peace.